Now, the junta-ruled Burkina Faso has become the latest African nation to pass a law banning homosexuality.
Burkina Faso's story has always been told in contrasts. The world often frames Africa in extremes: conflict or progress, tradition or modernity. But the truth is that many of the continent's turning points arrive quietly. They appear invisible until suddenly a law or decision makes them impossible to ignore. That is exactly what has happened in Burkina Faso. For decades, the country held a unique position in Africa when it came to same-sex relations. Unlike many nations that criminalized homosexuality during or after colonial rule, Burkina Faso never wrote such laws into its books. At independence from France in 1960, the Penal Code remained silent on the subject. That silence was not acceptance, nor was it activism, it was simply the absence of prohibition. This set Burkina Faso apart from much of the continent, where harsh laws inherited from colonial administrations punished homosexuality with prison sentences or worse. In Burkina Faso, people could not be jailed for their private lives, not because the society embraced it, but because the law refused to touch it. But silence is never the same as freedom. Social conservatism, shaped by religion and tradition, made homosexuality taboo. It was a subject avoided in public, condemned in private, and rarely acknowledged in politics. Still, the neutrality of the law mattered. It meant that, on paper, the state did not take a stance against its citizens' private choices. For more than 60 years, that silence endured. Then came 2024, the transitional government led by Captain Ibrahim Traoré introduced a draft amendment to the Family Code. For the first time in Burkina Faso's history, homosexuality was explicitly defined as a criminal offense. The move did not come in isolation. Across Africa, similar laws were gaining ground. In neighboring Mali, the junta had already passed a ban. Uganda shocked the world with one of the harshest anti-LGBT laws on earth, even including the death penalty in certain cases. Ghana debated its own restrictions. Nigeria had long enforced prohibitions. Burkina Faso, once an exception, was now shifting into alignment with a broader continental pattern. That alignment became official in September 2025. Burkina Faso's parliament voted unanimously to outlaw homosexual acts. The new law prescribes 2 to 5 years in prison, fines, and deportation for foreigners. Justice Minister Idaso Rodrigue Bayala defended the law as a way to protect society from what he called bizarre behavior. His words echo the sentiment of a deeply religious nation where over 90% of citizens identify with either Islam or Christianity. Overnight, what had once been tolerated in silence became punishable by law. This reversal was more than legal housekeeping. It carried symbolic weight. Burkina Faso chose to give voice to what was once left unspoken. Silence had been replaced with certainty, neutrality with judgment. To its leaders, this was not about inventing new morality, but about affirming long-held cultural and religious beliefs. And yet, this decision raises a bigger question. How does a country affirm its cultural sovereignty without risking isolation in a world dominated by different values? Across Africa, nations are finding their own voice on issues of law and morality. Many governments are pushing back against what they see as foreign interference, asserting independence not only in politics and economics, but also in culture. Yet with sovereignty comes friction. Global institutions such as the United Nations and the World Bank often measure nations by human rights standards rooted in Western liberal ideals. These standards rarely align with African traditions or religious norms. For Burkina Faso, this creates a dilemma: how to protect its cultural identity while avoiding sanctions, penalties, or loss of aid. What happened in Ouagadougou is not an isolated act. History shows that African countries rarely move alone. When one nation redraws its laws, others often follow, not by imitation, but through shared struggles and shared conditions. Burkina Faso's new law fits into a continental moment where governments are reasserting control over morality and law, often in defiance of Western criticism. To fully understand this, we must step back and see the wider Sahelian context. Under Captain Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso has presented itself as part of a regional awakening. The country has expelled French troops, challenged Western dominance, and formed new alliances with Mali and Niger. Sovereignty has become its rallying cry in security, economics, and now culture. Seen this way, the criminalization of homosexuality is not just about private behavior. It is a political statement. It declares, "We, not outsiders, decide what governs our land." For many Burkinabe, this resonates deeply. In mosques, churches, and family gatherings, morality is understood in collective terms. Private behavior is not seen as purely private. It affects families, communities, ancestors, and even the spiritual order. Laws, then, are expected to preserve harmony, not just protect individual freedom. That is why the unanimous vote in Parliament was no surprise. It reflected a consensus across society, a shared worldview shaped by religion and tradition. For many citizens, this was not about restricting liberty but about safeguarding cultural identity. But politics is never simple. Critics argue that such laws serve as a distraction. Burkina Faso faces immense challenges: an ongoing insurgency, widespread poverty, and fragile infrastructure. By focusing on morality, some say the government rallies popular support and diverts attention from more urgent crises. Whether this is a cynical move or a genuine reflection of public values is up for debate. What is undeniable is that the law resonates with the people. And yet, Burkina Faso does not exist in isolation. It trades, negotiates, and seeks investment from the wider world. Already, rights groups are warning of consequences. International donors may impose penalties. Loans could be delayed. Sanctions could cut deep. But here lies the emerging strategy of Africa. More and more, nations are seeking to reduce dependence on Western aid. They are turning instead to partnerships with non-Western allies, Russia, China, and regional neighbors. For Burkina Faso, alliances with Mali and Niger are more than military or economic. They provide breathing space, a shield against Western pressure. With such backing, governments can prioritize local values without fearing immediate punishment from Washington, Paris, or Brussels. This is why Burkina Faso's law must be seen in a broader light. It is part of Africa's larger shift toward sovereignty. It marks a step toward governance rooted in local culture, even at the cost of international friction. Whether this approach can succeed depends on the resilience of African economies and the strength of new alliances. At its core, the law reflects three layers: religion, culture, and politics. Religion runs deep in Burkina Faso, where Islam, Christianity, and traditional beliefs form the moral foundation of daily life. These faiths converge on certain values, one of which is the rejection of homosexuality. When the Justice Minister spoke of bizarre behavior, he was echoing the language of homes, mosques, and churches across the nation. Culturally, African societies often prioritize the collective over the individual. What a person does in private is seen as part of the community's well-being. In this sense, laws against homosexuality are understood not as restrictions on liberty, but as measures to protect social harmony. Politically, Captain Traoré faces enormous pressures. By passing this law, his government signals that it is listening to the people's cultural instincts rather than bending to Western norms. It reinforces his image as a leader committed to independence, willing to defy global criticism in defense of national values. But the road ahead is uncertain. Sanctions and aid cuts could harm an economy already under strain. Development, security, and poverty reduction remain urgent challenges. Cultural sovereignty on its own does not feed families or build infrastructure. The test for Burkina Faso, and for Africa as a whole, is whether the spirit of independence can be matched by concrete progress in development and governance. Still, the symbolism cannot be ignored. For decades, Africa was described as a continent acted upon, ruled by colonial powers, directed by aid donors, pressured by foreign governments. Today, decisions like Burkina Faso's are part of a new era. They represent a continent determined to define its values, even when those values clash with global expectations. The real question is this: can the world accept a continent that insists on defining its own morality? Or will Africa always be judged by standards it did not create? Burkina Faso's choice matters because it is about more than sexuality. It is about sovereignty. It is about who gets to decide the moral compass of a society: international institutions or the people themselves. For Africans, the answer is clear. Laws must reflect faith, culture, and collective identity. For Western critics, such laws represent intolerance. The two worldviews collide, but Africa is refusing to remain silent. Burkina Faso has declared that its laws, like its destiny, will be decided in Ouagadougou, not in Paris, Washington, or Brussels. Whether the world agrees or not, Africa is speaking, and it intends to be heard. So here is the question: is Burkina Faso defending its culture, or isolating itself from the global stage? Should Africa define its own laws without outside pressure, And how should nations balance cultural sovereignty with the need for development and cooperation? Let us know what you think in the comments. And if you want to hear more stories about Black culture, African history, and the struggles and triumphs of the continent, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Because Africa is writing its own story, and it is time the world listened.